In the spring of 1944, Europe was a continent scarred by fire and blood. The Second World War had already claimed millions of lives, flattened cities, and turned once thriving towns into ghostly ruins. Amid the chaos, as tanks rumbled across the fields of France and artillery shells shook the earth, a different kind of battle was quietly being prepared, one that required no bullets, no grenades, and no bloodshed. This was a war fought with imagination, with art, with deception. This was the work of the Ghost Army. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, as they were formally called, were a secret unit of the United States Army. Few knew of their existence at the time, and for decades after the war, their missions remained classified. They were soldiers, yes, but also artists, designers, sound engineers, and performers. Their task was audacious: to mislead, confuse, and manipulate the German forces through illusions so convincing that they could change the course of entire battles. The men recruited for this unit came from the most unlikely places: art schools, advertising firms, theater workshops, and radio studios across the United States supplied the soldiers with the skills they would need. Painters, sculptors, sound technicians, and set designers all donned military uniforms and learned to turn their creative talents into instruments of war. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were illusionists, theatrical engineers, masters of psychological warfare. Their training was as unique as their mission. They studied military formations and learned the precise way units marched and maneuvered. They were taught to observe the enemy's reconnaissance patterns and understand what German intelligence officers would expect to see on the battlefield. Then they learned to create the unexpected. A tank could be nothing more than inflated rubber and canvas, but from the air it could appear as an entire armored division. A few strategically placed speakers could simulate the thunderous advance of a mechanized column. A clever arrangement of lights and shadows could convince the enemy that artillery was stationed where, in reality, there was nothing at all. From the moment they arrived in England, the Ghost Army operated under a veil of secrecy. Orders were often delivered in code, and the soldiers moved under cover of night, carrying props, paint, and inflatable vehicles. Their mission was to ensure the safety of Allied troops by drawing enemy attention away from the real attacks. Each deception required meticulous planning, attention to detail, and unwavering courage. Mistakes could be fatal. If the Germans realized the truth, the men of the Ghost Army could be captured, executed, or left behind enemy lines. Yet their work was not just technical, it was creative. The soldiers painted large canvas tanks that would inflate in minutes, designed fake artillery placements, and built dummy jeeps. They constructed entire encampments of papier-mâché and wood. Radio operators transmitted fake conversations between officers, mimicking the tone, cadence, and jargon of real units. Artists sketched insignias and unit numbers for formations that did not exist, creating an illusion so seamless that even seasoned German officers could be fooled. The Ghost Army also understood the importance of sound. They used high-powered loudspeakers mounted on trucks to replicate the rumble of tanks and the shuffle of troops. They timed the sounds carefully to match the movement of their props, creating a three-dimensional illusion that could deceive not only those on the ground, but also reconnaissance planes flying overhead. Every detail, from the ruts left in the dirt to the flickering glow of campfires, was designed to fool the enemy's senses completely. What made the Ghost Army truly remarkable was the combination of artistry and strategy. They were not merely creating illusions, they were conducting psychological operations. Their goal was to make the Germans believe that Allied forces were far larger and better positioned than they actually were. By doing so, they could slow enemy movements, redirect artillery, and protect real troops from unnecessary casualties. Each success was measured not in destroyed enemy equipment, but in lives saved, in enemy decisions influenced, in battles won without firing a single shot. The Ghost Army's first major operation would come soon after their deployment to the European continent. They were assigned to support the push through France following D-Day, tasked with creating phantom divisions in locations far from the actual front lines. Inflatable tanks were rolled into fields under cover of darkness. Dummy trucks and jeeps were positioned with careful precision. Radio operators broadcasted conversations that would be intercepted by German intelligence, describing troop movements, supply schedules, and unit assignments that existed only in imagination. As the days passed, the Germans responded exactly as the Ghost Army had hoped. Reconnaissance planes reported columns of tanks that were nothing more than rubber and canvas. Enemy commanders diverted their units, moved artillery, and prepared for attacks that would never come. All the while, Allied forces maneuvered through less defended sectors, achieving objectives with far fewer casualties. The Ghost Army had proven the effectiveness of deception as a weapon, and the stage was set for even more daring operations. Despite the extraordinary creativity of their work, the Ghost Army also faced the harsh realities of war. They lived in the same muddy fields as frontline soldiers, slept in tents under the threat of attack, and endured harsh weather conditions. Inflatable tanks could be punctured by shrapnel, and radio transmissions could be intercepted or traced. Every day required improvisation, ingenuity, and courage. But their training, combined with the natural talent of artists and performers, allowed them to turn every challenge into an opportunity for deception. By the end of 1944, the Ghost Army had become a legend in secrecy. Their operations had misled German forces multiple times, saving countless lives and facilitating the advance of Allied armies across France. They were soldiers who wielded paintbrushes and speakers instead of rifles, creating illusions that were as effective as any weapon of war. And yet, for decades, their contributions remained largely unknown, hidden in classified reports and the memories of those who served. The story of the Ghost Army is not just a tale of military strategy, it is a story of human ingenuity, courage, and creativity in the darkest hours of history. These men took their artistic talents and applied them to the most serious of endeavors: survival, protection, and victory in a world at war. In a battlefield defined by destruction, they fought a war of illusions, a war where imagination was the greatest weapon of all. Even today, decades later, the Ghost Army stands as a testament to the power of creativity. It reminds us that art, when applied with vision and purpose, can change the course of events, influence outcomes, and save lives. In 1944, a group of artists, engineers, and performers stepped onto the fields of France and used their imagination to shape the destiny of a continent. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not steel, not fire, not blood, but the human mind itself. In the fields of Europe, the Ghost Army transformed ordinary landscapes into scenes of elaborate deception. Where there were no tanks, there appeared entire armored divisions. Where there were only a few trucks, the Germans saw convoys stretching for miles. Every illusion was painstakingly designed to deceive, and every detail mattered. It was not enough to place a rubber tank in a field. It had to cast the right shadow, sit in the correct orientation, and appear battle-worn in a way that would convince reconnaissance planes and enemy officers alike. The soldiers of the Ghost Army had at their disposal a remarkable arsenal of props and techniques. Giant inflatable tanks, some nearly 30 feet long, could be set up in minutes. Dummy artillery pieces, constructed from canvas, plywood, and wire, were carefully arranged in firing formations. Jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks were fabricated from lightweight materials, painted to mimic mud and wear, and positioned to suggest constant activity. Every element was designed to look real from a distance, and more importantly, from the air. But visual deception alone was not sufficient. The Ghost Army relied heavily on sound to complete the illusion. Massive speakers were mounted on trucks, playing pre-recorded engine noises, the clang of metal, and the shouts of soldiers. At a distance, it was impossible to tell whether 100 tanks were moving across a field or a handful of men were orchestrating the sounds with clever engineering. The combination of sight, sound, and movement created a convincing three-dimensional illusion, one that forced the Germans to respond to forces that did not exist. Radio operators played a critical role in these operations. They meticulously mimicked the communications of real units, broadcasting conversations between officers, coordinating supply convoys, and even arguing over trivial matters. Every broadcast was timed and formatted to match the style of Allied communications, ensuring that German signals intelligence would accept it as genuine. The Germans, relying on these intercepted messages, overestimated the size, location, and strength of Allied forces. The Ghost Army had turned misinformation into a lethal weapon. The soldiers who carried out these operations were a unique blend of artist and tactician. Painters sketched unit insignias that had never existed, creating the illusion of divisions with histories and reputations. Designers and engineers built fake encampments with sleeping tents, campfires, and improvised fortifications. Even the smallest details, like the placement of a discarded helmet or a pile of empty ration cans, were carefully considered to make the scene believable. Every object served the purpose of storytelling, convincing the enemy that an entire army was present where only a handful of men stood. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ghost Army was their ability to adapt and improvise. Weather, terrain, and enemy activity often threatened to ruin their illusions, but they learned to adjust on the fly. A sudden rainstorm might ruin painted tire tracks, forcing soldiers to repaint them. A reconnaissance plane might appear earlier than expected, requiring the rapid repositioning of props. In every case, the men of the Ghost Army relied on creativity, skill, and nerves of steel to maintain the deception. Their work required immense coordination. Teams of painters, engineers, sound technicians, and radio operators had to operate in perfect synchronization. Timing was crucial. Trucks carrying inflatable tanks had to arrive just before a broadcast began. Sound trucks had to move along planned routes to match the simulated movement of the imaginary forces. Visual props had to be oriented correctly relative to the sun and the terrain. Every operation was a carefully choreographed performance, executed under the constant threat of discovery. The Ghost Army's operations were often conducted near active combat zones, where the risk of artillery fire, sniper attacks, and air raids was ever present. Despite the danger, they maintained their composure, using discipline and ingenuity to turn ordinary materials into instruments of war. Their ability to function under stress, to improvise with limited resources, and to maintain the illusion under scrutiny was unparalleled. They were not merely soldiers, they were masters of perception, experts in the art of manipulation and misdirection. One notable operation took place during the push toward Aachen in late 1944. The Ghost Army was tasked with simulating a massive buildup of forces in a sector that the Germans believed would be attacked. Inflatable tanks were rolled into place under the cover of night. Dummy artillery pieces were positioned in firing formations, and sound trucks broadcast the roar of advancing armor. At the same time, radio operators transmitted messages coordinating non-existent supply convoys and troop movements. When German reconnaissance planes flew over the area the next morning, they reported what they believed was a formidable concentration of Allied forces. The deception worked flawlessly, diverting enemy troops and artillery away from the actual point of attack. The Ghost Army also understood the importance of psychological impact. The appearance of large, powerful forces created confusion and uncertainty within the German command. Officers were forced to make strategic decisions based on false information, often committing troops to defend areas that were, in reality, empty. By manipulating perception, the Ghost Army could influence enemy behavior, shape the battlefield, and save countless lives. Their weapon was not destruction but belief, the ability to make the enemy see what did not exist. Beyond the battlefield, the Ghost Army maintained an air of creativity and camaraderie. They were, after all, artists and performers as well as soldiers. When not engaged in operations, they created sketches, painted murals, and performed music to maintain morale. Their time in the field was grueling and dangerous, but they found moments of beauty, humor, and humanity in the midst of war. These creative outlets not only bolstered their spirits but also reinforced their skills, sharpening their perception, observation, and attention to detail. By the end of 1944, the Ghost Army had become a critical component of Allied strategy in Western Europe. Their ability to deceive the enemy on multiple fronts, to simulate entire divisions, and to manipulate German decision-making had been proven repeatedly. Yet, despite their success, their work remained largely unrecognized. Secrecy was paramount, and the men of the Ghost Army returned home after the war without fanfare, their contributions largely unknown to the public. The legacy of the Ghost Army lies not only in their military achievements, but also in the remarkable fusion of art and strategy they embodied. They demonstrated that creativity can be a powerful tool in the most unexpected of arenas. In a war defined by destruction, they fought with imagination, sound, and perception. They transformed simple materials into lifelike illusions, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. Every inflatable tank, every painted jeep, every broadcasted radio message represented a calculated act of artistry and cunning. The Ghost Army had proven that victory in war could come not just from force of arms, but from the mastery of perception, the ability to shape reality in the minds of the enemy, and the courage to execute extraordinary plans under extreme risk. As historians would later note, the Ghost Army operated at the intersection of creativity, psychology, and warfare. They were innovators, pioneers, and visionaries. In the midst of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, they showed that art and imagination could be as lethal as bullets and bombs. And so, in fields that have long since returned to quiet grass and soil, the echoes of their work remain. Shadows of tanks that never existed, roads lined with vehicles made of rubber and canvas, and the invisible threads of sound and light that once deceived an entire army. The Ghost Army, through ingenuity, courage, and imagination, had turned illusion into reality, saving lives and shaping the war in ways that would only be fully understood decades later. By early 1945, the Allied armies were pressing toward Germany, and the final chapters of the European War were unfolding. The Rhine River stood as the last great barrier, a wide, fast-flowing obstacle defended by entrenched German forces. Crossing it was essential for the Allies to invade the heart of Germany, but the enemy knew the terrain intimately, and the threat of artillery, mines, and counterattacks loomed large. It was here, in this critical moment, that the Ghost Army would orchestrate what is perhaps their most daring and brilliant operation. Operation Viersen. Operation Viersen was, at its core, a performance of staggering scale and precision. The goal was deceptively simple: to convince the German army that two entire divisions of Allied forces were preparing to cross the Rhine at a specific location, when in reality, the real crossing was planned miles away. The deception would require an intricate combination of visual illusions, sound engineering, and radio manipulation, all timed to perfection. Any misstep could result in exposure, with deadly consequences for both the illusionists and the soldiers, depending on their work. The Ghost Army arrived in the sector under cover of darkness, moving trucks, inflatable tanks, and dummy artillery pieces into carefully prepared positions. Engineers and artists worked side by side, constructing fake bridges and gun emplacements that would never support real soldiers. Canvas tanks were inflated, and wooden artillery pieces were painted to match the mud and grime of real equipment. Even the positioning of tents, supply crates, and campfires was calculated to create the illusion of a bustling, fully equipped division. Sound was a key component of the deception. Massive speakers, hidden behind sandbags and dummy vehicles, broadcast the roar of engines, the clatter of tank treads, and the shouts of soldiers. The timing of the audio was synchronized with vehicle movements, creating the sense of an entire army on the move. Nighttime illumination added another layer. Flickering lights simulated welding, vehicle headlights glimmered along the horizon, and shadowy figures moved among the props, suggesting the presence of hundreds of troops. From a distance, the phantom army appeared alive, mobile, and ready for action. Radio operators contributed their own mastery of illusion. They transmitted messages in the style of authentic Allied units, coordinating non-existent supply convoys, reporting troop dispositions, and even holding mundane arguments between officers. The Germans, listening closely to these intercepted transmissions, were convinced that the divisions were real, well-equipped, and ready to strike. Every detail, from the cadence of orders to the language used, was meticulously designed to fool the enemy. The operation lasted 3 days, with the Ghost Army working tirelessly through mud, rain, and freezing temperatures. Soldiers moved props, adjusted radio equipment, and monitored German reconnaissance flights. Each man understood the stakes. If the deception failed, the enemy would be alerted to the true crossing location, and countless Allied soldiers could be killed or captured. Yet despite the exhaustion and pressure, the soldiers carried out their roles with unwavering focus, blending technical skill, artistry, and courage. German reconnaissance soon reported the phantom divisions. Commanders redirected artillery and troops to counter the perceived threat, leaving the actual crossing point with minimal resistance. Meanwhile, Allied forces crossed the Rhine in relative safety, achieving their objectives with fewer casualties and less risk than would have been possible without the Ghost Army's intervention. The operation was a resounding success, a testament to the power of deception and the ingenuity of the men who executed it. Operation Viersen showcased not only the technical skill of the Ghost Army, but also their creativity and adaptability. Weather and enemy activity constantly threatened to disrupt the illusion. A sudden rainstorm might wash away painted tracks, requiring rapid adjustments. Enemy reconnaissance flights could appear unexpectedly, forcing the rapid repositioning of props. In every case, the soldiers responded with improvisation, ingenuity, and calm under pressure, demonstrating their exceptional ability to manipulate perception in real time. The men of the Ghost Army were more than soldiers. They were artists and performers, operating under the highest stakes imaginable. Painters created lifelike insignias for fictitious divisions, sound engineers replicated the thunder of moving armor, and engineers built props that could deceive even the most experienced enemy observers. Each operation was a meticulously choreographed performance, executed with the precision of theater, yet with consequences measured in lives saved and battles won. The success of Operation Viersen had far-reaching implications. By diverting German forces away from the true crossing point, the Ghost Army facilitated the rapid advance of Allied troops into Germany. Their deception created opportunities for real combat units to move with greater safety and efficiency, demonstrating that perception could be as powerful as firepower. In the eyes of military strategists, the operation was a masterclass in psychological warfare and tactical ingenuity. Even in moments of rest, the soldiers of the Ghost Army found ways to maintain morale and creativity. Sketchbooks were filled with drawings of their illusions, humorous caricatures of officers, and meticulous notes on camouflage techniques. They shared stories, played music, and found small moments of levity in the midst of immense pressure. These creative expressions were not only personal outlets, but also reinforced the skills necessary for their mission, sharpening observation, attention to detail, and spatial awareness. By the conclusion of Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army had proven the full potential of deception as a tool of war. Their ability to manipulate the perceptions of an entire army had tangible, life-saving effects on the battlefield. Yet their work remained classified, hidden from the public eye for decades. The men returned home, blending once more into civilian life, their extraordinary contributions largely unknown outside military circles. The story of Operation Viersen stands as a testament to human ingenuity under extreme circumstances. It demonstrates that imagination, when applied with precision and courage, can be as powerful as any weapon. The Ghost Army had turned art into strategy, deception into survival, and creativity into victory. They had proven that even in the most brutal and chaotic of conflicts, the mind could shape reality, influence outcomes, and save lives. Today, as historians reflect on the events of the final months of World War II, Operation Viersen shines as a remarkable example of tactical innovation. It was not merely an act of deception. It was a carefully orchestrated performance that changed the course of a campaign. The inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, and simulated divisions remain symbols of the extraordinary ingenuity of a group of soldiers who fought not with bullets, but with perception and imagination. Even now, the legacy of the Ghost Army echoes through the fields of Europe. The ground they once occupied has long returned to quiet farmland. Yet the memory of their ingenuity lingers. Shadows of tanks that never existed, roads lined with empty trucks, and the invisible threads of sound that deceived an enemy army remain a powerful reminder. Sometimes, the greatest victories are won not by force, but by the mind. In Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army achieved their most audacious triumph. They demonstrated that art could serve strategy, that deception could protect lives, and that courage was not only measured in bullets fired, but in ideas executed flawlessly under pressure. They were, in every sense, pioneers of psychological warfare, blending creativity, technical skill, and bravery to shape the course of history. And as the Rhine flowed quietly beneath the morning sun, it carried with it the echoes of a performance that had saved countless lives. A performance executed by an army that existed mostly in shadows, illusions, and imagination, yet whose impact was profoundly real. War has a way of turning ordinary men into soldiers, but the men of the Ghost Army were never ordinary. Before they carried rifles and radios, they carried sketchbooks, paintbrushes, and ideas. They were artists, engineers, set designers, and sound technicians. Creators who suddenly found themselves in a world of destruction. And in that world, they used their creativity not to destroy, but to protect. Among them were names that would later become known in the art world. Bill Blass, who would go on to become a world-famous fashion designer, once painted camouflage nets and Jeep hoods. Ellsworth Kelly, later celebrated for his bold color fields in modern art, spent nights designing dummy equipment and studying light and shadow to make fake tanks look real under the moon. Arthur Singer, a wildlife artist who would one day paint delicate birds, learned to mimic the chaotic brushstrokes of war. These men, and hundreds like them, used the same tools that once expressed beauty to now create deception. Their backgrounds were as diverse as their talents. Some came from advertising agencies, where they had learned the art of persuasion. Others were sculptors or architects who understood form and structure. Many were illustrators and painters who could capture light and perspective with uncanny precision. Together, they formed an army unlike any other, one that fought not with brute strength, but with imagination. In the quiet moments between operations, the Ghost Army returned to what they knew best: creating. They drew sketches of their surroundings: soldiers resting beside dummy tanks, towns scarred by bombings, and children playing in the ruins of war. Some painted portraits of their fellow soldiers, capturing the exhaustion and determination in their eyes. Others filled notebooks with watercolors of the French countryside, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. These artworks, many of which still survive, tell a side of the war that official reports never could: the story of beauty, resilience, and humor amid chaos. Their living conditions were harsh. Mud, rain, and cold were constant companions. They slept in tents beside their inflatable tanks, ate rations heated over small fires, and worked through the night under the constant fear of discovery. German reconnaissance planes often flew overhead, searching for signs of the fake divisions. One mistake, one poorly placed shadow or incorrect radio signal could expose the illusion and put their lives at risk. Yet despite the pressure, they approached their missions like artists working on a canvas. Every operation was a composition. Every sound, every prop, every movement had to be in harmony. The camaraderie among these men was something extraordinary. They came from different backgrounds, but they shared a sense of humor, curiosity, and purpose. They joked about their inflatable tanks, calling them rubber babies, and sometimes posed beside them for photographs, smiling in the face of danger. They performed skits, played music, and told stories to keep their spirits alive. In a war filled with tragedy, the Ghost Army found moments of laughter, light, and creativity. But behind the laughter lay a constant awareness of risk. The Ghost Army often operated close to the front lines, sometimes within artillery range. There were moments when the illusion came dangerously close to unraveling. On one occasion, a group of German soldiers approached what they believed was a U.S. tank position, only to find a field of rubber and air. The Ghost Army barely escaped, dismantling their props under enemy fire. Each narrow escape was a reminder that their art, as brilliant as it was, existed in the deadly theater of war. Still, they carried on. They painted, built, and broadcast illusions that saved thousands of lives. Every time they created a phantom army, real soldiers fought and died somewhere else. But fewer of them, thanks to the deception. Their success was measured not in destruction, but in protection. It was a quiet kind of heroism, invisible and uncelebrated. Even among themselves, the men sometimes questioned what they were doing. They were artists turned tricksters, their creativity used to mislead rather than to inspire. Yet most came to understand the deeper meaning of their work. Their illusions, though false in form, carried truth in purpose. To end the war sooner, to save lives, to use imagination as a shield rather than a weapon. Many of the Ghost Army's members kept diaries and journals, filled with reflections that still resonate today. Some wrote about the strangeness of fighting a war through art, the surreal mix of paint and danger, of beauty and destruction. Others described the haunting quiet that followed each operation, when the props were packed away and the field stood empty once more. In those moments, they were reminded that what they had built was both powerful and fleeting, a masterpiece designed to disappear. When the war finally ended in 1945, the men of the Ghost Army returned home. They resumed their lives as artists, designers, and dreamers. Some continued their studies, others opened studios, and a few became leading figures in post-war art and design. Yet for decades they could not speak of what they had done. Their missions were classified, their contributions hidden. They carried their memories in silence, bound by secrecy and humility. It wasn't until decades later that the truth began to emerge. Veterans of the Ghost Army started to share their stories, and historians began uncovering the extent of their contributions. The sketches, paintings, and photographs they had saved offered a glimpse into their unique world. A world where creativity met warfare, where deception became art, and where imagination saved lives. Looking back, their work stands as a testament to the human spirit. In a time when the world was consumed by destruction, these men chose creation. They took the skills they had learned in studios and theaters and turned them into tools of survival. They proved that even in the darkest moments of history, art could illuminate, protect, and heal. The Ghost Army was more than a military unit. It was a statement, a declaration that creativity, when guided by courage and purpose, could change the course of history. The men who painted, built, and performed illusions on the battlefields of Europe left behind more than victories. They left behind a legacy of imagination, a reminder that even in war, the human mind remains a force of limitless potential. As one soldier later wrote in his journal, "We painted tanks instead of portraits, built battlefields instead of sets. But in the end, we were still artists, just artists trying to make the world whole again." The Ghost Army's story reminds us that courage is not only found in the trenches or on the front lines. Sometimes, it is found in the quiet hands of an artist, working by lamplight, creating illusions that will never be seen, yet changing the course of history nonetheless. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world emerged from darkness. Cities lay in ruins, millions were gone, and nations began the long process of rebuilding. Amid the celebration of victory, the Ghost Army disappeared quietly into history, their names unspoken, their deeds unrecorded. For decades, their story remained hidden. The files were locked away, the missions classified, and the men themselves went home to build new lives. They married, raised families, and pursued their art once again. Some became painters, architects, or teachers. Others returned to fashion, design, and theater. They carried with them memories that could not be shared, of inflatable tanks that had fooled the enemy, of fake armies that had saved real lives, of a war fought with imagination. It wasn't until the 1980s that fragments of their secret began to surface. Historians stumbled upon declassified documents, and veterans slowly began to tell their stories. The truth astonished the world. These soldiers had waged a war of illusion, not with violence, but with vision. They had risked their lives for an idea, that creativity could defend as surely as firepower, that art could be a weapon for peace. Recognition came slowly, but when it did, it was profound. Exhibitions showcased their surviving sketches, maps, and photographs, works of art born from deception. The public saw the faces of the men who had once painted shadows on the battlefield, and admiration replaced secrecy. In 2022, the United States Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Ghost Army, finally honoring their extraordinary contribution to freedom. Their legacy lives on, not only in history books, but in the fields of modern warfare, design, and art. Today, militaries around the world study the Ghost Army's methods, camouflage, psychological operations, and misinformation, refined into strategies that continue to shape conflicts in the digital age. Yet beyond tactics and technology, their story carries a deeper lesson. The Ghost Army proved that creativity can be an act of courage. They showed that imagination, when guided by purpose, can save lives and change destinies. In a time when the world seemed lost to destruction, they used art to protect, to mislead, and ultimately, to heal. Their illusions were temporary, but their impact endures, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to find beauty even in the midst of war. As time passes, fewer of them remain, but their legacy, their belief in the power of imagination, continues to inspire artists, soldiers, and dreamers alike. The inflatable tanks have long deflated, their canvases folded away. The paint has faded, the props dismantled. Yet the idea they carried burns bright, that in the face of darkness, creativity can be light. In the end, the Ghost Army was never truly about deception. It was about vision, the ability to see beyond destruction and to imagine a different kind of strength. A strength that does not kill, but protects. A strength that turns fear into wonder. A strength that lives on, long after the war has ended. They were soldiers. They were artists. They were ghosts. And their art, their courage, their imagination will never fade.